Okay, I became aware of the Belarusian Cyber Partisans in my own research, which often involves primary and secondary media sources from Russia and Eastern Europe. I came across an article published by Important Stories from March of 2023 that talked about hashtag Russian censor files. Apparently, there had been a hack and leak of Russian government documents that showed immense censorship of anti-war activists, political dissenters, and much more. The group cited in this hack were the Belarusian Cyber Partisans. I eventually found their Twitter and Telegram accounts, which led me to Yuliana. So first, thanks for taking the time to speak with me, Yuliana.
Of course. Thank you for inviting me to this podcast.
Yeah, so Yuliana, what are the Cyber Partisans and what role do you serve with this group?
Sure. So Cyper Partisans is a hacktivist collective, a Belarusian hacktivist collective. They are part of the larger opposition movement. They are not like maybe the regular hacktivist groups that you imagine. It's more centralized. It's, as I said, a part of a resistance movement. And recently they joined their forces with the regiment, Belarusian regiment Kostuskalinovsky, fighting in Ukraine. So the strategies, the plans are discussed with them as well. And they developed their expertise since 2020 when the protests started in Belarus. And, the protesters were violently suppressed, beaten up. They went through many horrible things in prisons and still going through, because up to 100 people every month get detained in Belarus. So the members of Cyper Partisans group decided to fight back, to respond to this violence. They couldn't defend themselves, but they could use their expertise, mind, knowledge in order to fight the Belarusian regime back. And since that time, that's what they're doing. They're not professional hackers. They learned everything on the go. And, since that time, they're doing everything possible to harm the Belarusian regime, to get information, to protect activists, to protect Belarusians living inside Belarus. And of course, since the war started, we're helping Ukraine as much as it's possible. Strategically, Russia is our enemy as well. We always supported Ukraine as a part of the Belarusian movement. We always condemned Russia. And this is like something that is important for us. So Cyper Partisans conduct some of the operations against Russia as well.
So speaking about some of those things that operations you've all done against Russia, that in my own research, I did see that there was some reporting in the West about interruptions to Belarusian rail lines to disrupt the transportation of military vehicles, for instance, for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. When I dug a little bit deeper, what I found equally as interesting were the conversations and video captured by Cyber Partisans of Belarusian police discussing how to, quote unquote, handle protesters, along with video showing excessive force against protesters. Can you describe what was found regarding government or police actions toward protesters or just general human rights abuses during the last election in Belarus?
Sure. We are working closely with the human rights organizations. We provide information about those who committed those crimes. We provide anything like any recordings that were found during the hack of the Minister of Internal Affairs. This hack happened in 2021, and during that time, Cyper Partisans obtained a lot of useful information. For example, passport info of all Belarusians, including those with restrictive access. So now we can check those who work for the regime, who secretly work for the regime. Improve the verification processes for the opposition movements, because the regime likes to interfere. They send their agents still. And part of this information that was obtained were also the recordings that a Minister of Internal Affairs were conducting. The interesting fact of these recordings is that mostly they didn't even spy on opposition leaders or regular citizens. They mostly were even spying on their own people. So in these recordings, you can hear very high-level politicians, working for the regime, very high-level people from inside of even Ministry of Internal Affairs discussing different stuff, their personal life, the commands they received from Lukashenko people, how to suppress people, what should be done. And they were even kind of discussing it with the excitement, that they have this power and that they can beat up men, women, doesn't matter. And then they feel full right to do so. And these recordings were independently analyzed. We also, at that time, worked closely with BIPOL. It's the organization of former police officers that decided to leave their work and side with the people, with the Belarusian people. They mostly now live in Warsaw, so they also helped us to identify some of the workers. They helped to find these recordings just by providing some information about the mobile phones, so it's easier for cyber partisans to search for specific recordings. And that, like, what was found, what was like caught our eye that we thought was shocking. Obviously, it was published, but to be honest, there are still a lot of recordings that haven't been analyzed. We have like 50,000 hours of conversations, I believe, and it's like we just don't have resources or time to dig in, but we believe there is still important and interesting information is hidden there. So we'll continue working on this.
Wow, that's that's really interesting. That is a lot of data to dig through. And in a interview that you had with Vice, it's about this time last year, I believe, you were discussing the railway disruption. And the way that you described it was interesting and significant, I think, for people to hear. You said the effort to disrupt military supplies meant for Russia's invasion of Ukraine served to, and quote, help remove Russian military troops that now occupy Belarus and fling Belarus into war with Ukraine. I think that there are some in the West who still see Belarus as something like a satellite state to Russia, or at least harboring very pro-Russian sentiment. Can you help describe the opposition's view of Russia and its invasion of Ukraine to maybe dispel some of these generalizations?
Sure. So the regime is pro-Russian. This is true. And among those who support the regime, there are still some. We believe it's up to 20 to 30% of the population. There are some who also have some Russian affiliations, but even among them, the experts say only a very small amount, around like 3 to 5%, would actually be happy if Russia fully occupies Belarus. So for those who support Lukashenko, it's still so important to keep the independence of Belarus. So they believe in themselves as a Belarusian, as a separate nation with its own culture, history, language, etc. As for the opposition, obviously it's pro-Western. We believe that Belarus is a part of Europe. We don't believe in it. It's just the fact. We always been a part of Europe, of Western Europe. Like the old, even constitution, the first constitution, I feel like in Europe was written in the old Belarusian language. Only in the end of 18th century, a Russian empire started to slowly occupy Belarusian territories, and only during that period of time the Russian influence came onto our territories, unfortunately. There were some, I feel like, efforts of the Belarusian opposition before the full-scale war started to play with Putin, to try to maybe cut the support of Putin to Lukashenko, or I don't know, play with maybe some of the like people who still thought that like Putin can have a role in it, or who were not as against of Russia. Which was highly criticized by other opposition groups. But that definitely changed. Now the opposition is united about like what Russia is, what is it capable of, and no one has any illusions about what Russia's goal about Belarus. They believe that Belarus belongs to its sphere of interest, it belongs to Russia, and they don't want that Belarus out. They don't believe the Belarusian nation exists, as they don't believe that the Ukrainian nation exists. And in that sense, people are united outside of Belarus and inside Belarus.
In that same video, which I'll link to this so listeners and viewers can get to it, you stated that the current regime in Belarus threatens Ukraine as well as the whole world. Can you elaborate on this? Why is this the case? And that was said about a year ago. So, maybe comment on if anything has escalated since then that might change that opinion.
You mean if the Belarusian regime is a threat, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So now these discussions are becoming even more, I feel like, important to everyone, to Europe, to the United States, because Lukashenko just recently confirmed that there will be nuclear weapons brought to Belarus that Russia will provide and Russia will control. And this is an actual threat to other countries. Even before this discussion started, there were always some rumors if Russia was successful in Ukraine, what are the chances that Belarus might stage some kind of attack on Poland or Lithuania borders, try to get some territories, or just threaten them in order not so they don't support Ukraine. So Russia has more dominance in Europe. And in that sense, obviously, Belarus, borders with Lithuania, Latvia, and Poland. And in Ukraine, we saw how Belarusian territory was used for Russian purposes, the same way it can be used for other purposes. And these discussions came back now with the nuclear weapons. There is an article in so-called prestigious Russian journal discussing that. Prestigious, I mean, it used to be even evaluated high among the scientists around the world from political or social departments. And in this article, they discuss how it might be beneficial for Russia, for example, to send a nuclear bomb to Poland in order to cut the support from it, to make them scared, to, raise the stakes. So in that sense, it most likely will be done from the Belarusian territory. It makes sense geographically. It makes sense also politically. Putin can always say, it's not me, it's Lukashenko. So bringing back Belarus into Europe, into making it a democracy, it's of course important from a security perspective. Of course, we can discuss the human rights situation in Belarus and how it is important to support people and the abuse of human rights, and like how these ideals and morals need to be spread. Yes, but it's not something that actually inspire other countries to fully support. What they actually care about, it's their own security, which makes sense. From a rational perspective, it makes sense. So I feel like the stakes even increased from the last time I spoke about the threat coming from the Belarusian dictator Lukashenko.
Yeah, certainly. That's something that I have other questions about, but I don't want to go down that road. I want to stay on course because that's very interesting. But to stay on course, again, I found you and the group because I found some articles about hashtag Russian censor files, and I made a kind of introductory video about them, and I'll continue to make videos about them and what I found. But for folks listening now, can you just describe what hashtag Russian censor files are and why they're important?
Sure. So Cyper Partisans attacked the radio frequency center that is part of the Roskomnadzor, which is the major Russian censorship entity that spies, monitors, and censor the Russian society and Russian-speaking society, meaning that they follow and try to suppress and provide their own narratives in other countries that have Russian-speaking population, like Belarus, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and others. So this hack helped to get this massive amount of documents, more than 1 terabyte of data, was obtained by Cyber Partisans, and then we decided to share it with independent journalists, mostly, of course, Russians, because it focuses on what's happening in Russia and how these tools are used against the Russian population. Of course, we didn't provide anyone who was geographically in Russia or who didn't have a clear statement about what's going on and about the war. If they, would say something like, "Oh, it's ambiguous. We have different view on this in our department," we would refuse then to provide this access. And then during these several months, some of the journalists, we also have our own specialists who did some investigations into how this Roskomnadzor entity works and uses technology in order to spy on people, in order to basically control the whole internet in Russia, and then how they suppress, how they try to use artificial intelligence in order to create, for example, bots. to to affect people's mood, which can be then transferred to other countries in other languages and try to affect the narratives there. That is what we're really afraid of. With the Russian population, it's clear kind of what's going on, but in the West, we still see, of course, a great support towards Ukraine, but it might change. People get tired from the war, so this is something that was very interesting and important for us to see, how they develop these tools. But of course, just to understand how they try to control the internet and how they're controlling their own population. For example, they created the messenger that sends information that Roskomnadzor collects in the internet from social media, from the comment sections, from different blogs, articles, you name it, everything. And then they have an easy way to send it directly to, for example, FSB. And then if they notice that there are some comments in part of the region against the mobilization, there are some posts in VK, which is Russian version of Facebook, and other social media, the FSB right away sends some groups in order to suppress this protest or something like that. So it's very efficient. They monitor and they try, and they do everything in order to control their own population.
Yeah, that's it's interesting that you said that. It kind of answers my next question, which was, it was more of a comment from me saying that from what I've gone through so far, the granularity has been what's kind of shocked me, even for things that I would consider to be pretty insignificant. As you said, like a VK post, not necessarily from a celebrity or a musician, just somebody, maybe saying Putin, I'm fed up with Putin, or something very basic, and the level, right, the level of reporting and the metadata collected, it seemed like a lot of effort, and I guess that surprised me.
They would even check, all the memes, like with
Right.
Putin, something that, obviously you don't even pay attention. You can make a lot of fun about presidents in the United States and other countries, make memes and stuff. But in Russia, obviously right away, you can be prosecuted for this.
Right. Right. Yeah. Prosecuted as well as just tracked, and the idea of even, having that report and then follow up on that report to predict things like you were saying, moods. And I was going to offer to you the question of what kind of, stood out to you, but I think maybe it might be that AI component, and I didn't want to mention that because I thought that might be where you might come from.
To be honest, that's not what shocked all of us, inside the group who worked with these files, even though I didn't work as much. I'm more reading and rooting for those who did it. But what actually shocked the most is how they actually monitor their own people, meaning those who work in Roskomnadzor. They have hundreds of employees because they couldn't figure out yet, at least, and it probably will take at least several years, how to automate their work. They still use a lot of human resources who review these reports because they're not as accurate, whatever is done by the AI. So, those people who monitor Russian moves, they're actual people, they work for the regime, but they've been monitored themselves. They use this Falcon Gaze system in order to check everything their workers were doing, every click, every, type, every message. Cyber Partisans used it to spy on them too, which was very interesting to see when the hack especially was revealed and the panic among those workers. But that's the extent of how the regime doesn't even trust their own people. They monitor them even more than the regular Russian citizen. This is insane.
They don't trust the AI, so they have people track the AI, but then they also don't trust the people either. It's just compounded on top of each other. This one is a bit subjective. So, do with it what you will. But it's been my experience that some in the West, especially those who are involved with political activism or protest, folks that might be, watching this or listening to this, that they feel compelled to at times, focus on the United States and what the United States does wrong. And that's justifiable, and that needs to happen. Every government needs to be held accountable. However, it can cross a line to the point of dismissing other global bad actors. what would you say to people who might try to diminish or equivocate what's happening in Russia or Belarus, for that matter, in order to put the U.S. at the center of all criticism?
It definitely makes us anxious. But listen, folks, I understand democracy is not perfect, but it's the best what we have. America is not perfect, but it's the best global player we have. So yes, we need to have the United States accountable. Yes, as you said, any government needs to be accountable, but we also need to understand, what's out there as well and compare. And, some people scream, oh, America shouldn't interfere into like this conflict, or they shouldn't support Ukraine, or America first and all of this. But if America is pulled out from the global market, from the global players, then someone will come to this spot, and it will be either Russia, China. Like if I have to choose between the United States and China, or God forbid Russia, obviously, my choice would be the United States. And it benefits its citizens, economically, from an economic standpoint, of course, the more kind of presence you have around the world, it is better for the economy. But in a political sense and security sense, it also makes sense if Russia becomes too powerful and start to, spread its influence in Europe and other countries that work with the United States. They have special agreements and all of it, especially if they collaborate with China. It means a security problem in the future. Right now, yes, it might not be seen directly, but in 10 years, for example, America might be involved not just from economic perspective, meaning supporting Ukraine, but they might need to send soldiers, and obviously no one wants to pay with blood for any future conflict where you actually need to protect yourself, because those players will try to interfere in the South America and Mexico and all of these countries in order to weaken the United States. So we always need to think strategically. Even if you, from a moral perspective or from any other perspective, you don't want to support Ukraine, think of it strategically. What gives Russia if they, win over, what it gives to China, what Europe can lose, and what the United States can lose if Ukraine loses. So we're grateful for all the politicians from right and left, from the elites and experts saying, we have to help Ukraine. It benefits from any angle you look at. And we hope that everyone does support this, because Russia is committing horrible crimes right now. And if you don't keep them accountable, they don't care. In the United States, you have tools, you have mechanism how to keep politicians accountable. Doesn't work perfectly each time, but you have those, and you can solve this in a civil way. You can't do this in Russia. You have to respond, and it's better for Ukraine to fight for it for the whole Europe pretty much right now. Then in the future, the American soldiers might be sent in order to protect the United States and other Western allies of the United States.
All right, and lastly, what has the group been up to since the activities surrounding the last Belarusian election, and why I've been involved with the hashtag Russian censor files? Is there any more current work that you'd like to highlight, or really just anything else that you would like viewers or listeners to know?
So we're working on several projects. Of course, the number one project is trying to gather information, to get information inside the Belarusian regime and inside Russian regime, and to conduct some attacks that can help Ukraine and can help Belarusian people. Some of these things we cannot say openly because obviously the members don't want to lose their access. So some of the operations are very secret, and some of them are ongoing because, for example, right now is not the moment to do some of the operations inside Belarus. We kind of wait for the moment when it can be supported by the population, and when Russia cannot support Lukashenko as much as they did in 2020. Some of the things are more open. For example, we analyze data, we provide data to international organizations, independent journalists, in order to conduct investigations about what's happening in the Belarusian regime and Russia. So it's also, we help actually Ukrainian special officers, meaning that they check Belarusians inside Ukraine, anyone who come in crossing. We have a regiment fighting in Ukraine on the side, obviously, of Ukraine. So these people need to be verified and checked, and with the databases that Cyber Partisans have, it's easy to do. And there are also some projects that we consider very important. For example, Cyber Partisans created Partisan Telegram. Telegram is an application, a messenger that is very popular in Eastern Europe. Pretty much everyone uses it, not only for even exchange of messages or like phone calls, it's also used to follow the news. You can subscribe to different channels and you can read the news, which is very important in repressed societies like in Belarus. You can't, there are no independent media anymore. You can't watch television. It's all propaganda. So for you even to read news about what's happening in Ukraine, you have to have this access to independent news source like Telegram. But the thing is, if you get detained in Belarus or even randomly search in transportation, and it happens all the time, and then they see you subscribe to this news channel, you're going to be detained. That's it. So for this type of cases, Cyber Partisans created this partisan telegram, which is based on fake codes. So if your phone is searched and you need to log in into a telegram, you can enter the fake password, which enable different type of actions. For example, it deletes all the messages that you marked before, or it unsubscribes you from specific news channels, or if you're an admin in the channel, it also removes you from this channel. So it's very useful for those who live in this type of societies like Belarus in the dictatorship state. But of course, it also is helpful in the occupied territories because the stakes are even higher there. Of course, if you help Ukrainian soldiers in the territories that were just occupied by Russians, you might be killed. So this is something we try to spread out and talk to people about, and we constantly develop and improve this application. We had an audit recently conducted by the Rochester University. So this is something that some of the projects that Cyber Partisans work on in order to provide safe tools for the population. This partisan telegram, there is another one, partisan messaging, which can be used without the internet even, and that sends encrypted messages. So the mobile operators won't be able to follow it. So things like that, because we do understand the kind of the problems that people have living in the countries like Belarus.
That's really interesting, and I think that even just describing the necessity for that might help, glean some insight into what's happening in the region for folks who don't live there as well. So, thank you again for taking time to speak with me, and I do hope that those listening agree 100% or not, as you said, maybe morally or this or that, but I do hope that those listening find solidarity with your efforts as well as the efforts of other activists, protesters, and dissidents in Belarus as well as Russia.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.